Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell and the rest of my team here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. If you're a somewhat frequent listener of this show, you have probably heard us talk before about the 6 basic human needs. While I'm not going to go into all 6 of those here, if you want that, you can go ahead and check out episode 44 for a deep dive into the concept. But suffice it to say that beyond food, water, shelter, clothing, fulfilling these 6 needs is critical to achieving our highest levels of satisfaction in life. One of those 6 needs is certainty, which is defined as the need for security, stability, and reliability. Now, there are lots of ways that we can achieve certainty in life, from knowing that we've got a steady income to creating a morning routine for ourselves. One critical component of the need for certainty, though, is safety. If I don't feel safe at home, in my community, or as we're going to focus on in this episode today, at work, it becomes very challenging for me to thrive and succeed to the level of what I'm truly capable of. In this episode, Mark and I had the pleasure of talking to Staci Martin. Staci is an agribusiness professional from Minnesota and the owner of Martin & Company. Pulling from her more than 15 years of experience, Staci shed some light on some of the things that those of us who are women in business should be considering from a safety standpoint, especially for those who travel a lot or who are on the road by themselves a lot of the time, like many of our salespeople. Speaking just from my own perspective, I think this is one of the most important topics we've covered on this show, whether you're a man or a woman. This discussion is not about the need to treat women differently in the workplace or to be limited in what we can do. Rather, we had this conversation for 2 big reasons. One, we want to help raise awareness to the fact that, good, bad, or otherwise, women often face different realities when it comes to safety, in that in order to do our jobs like the true badasses we are, we have to be paying attention to what those realities are. Second, it's also a reality that many companies, especially in agribusiness, are primarily led by men, both at senior leadership and middle management levels. As Mark mentions in this episode, sometimes men just don't realize the different experience that they've had compared to their female counterparts or team members. And I think as any of us can attest to, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. We want to support you, though, male leaders, in learning more about and becoming more aware to what those differences might be so that you can lead your team as effectively as possible. I promise that I'm almost done with this intro, but want to give a quick disclaimer. This conversation is not meant to be all-encompassing, give specific self-defense advice, or pertain to every type of role in the workplace. This is a brief conversation on a complex topic that, let's be honest, could span several episodes of this podcast. Some roles do require specific safety training, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about today. If you feel unsafe at work, please contact your manager or human resources person immediately for assistance. And if you encounter an unsafe situation while traveling, do not hesitate to contact the authorities. On the path from surviving to thriving, safety is a non-negotiable. It's our hope that this conversation sparks discussions in your organization or among your team to make sure that everyone feels safe and has the certainty to go out and execute at the level that we know you are all capable of. So, let's head over to the show. Well, Staci, welcome for your first time to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. We are very glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. We have a great topic to dig into here over the course of the next hour or so. But before we get started, Staci, I would really love if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you came from. Just fill us in and help people get to know you a little bit.
Absolutely. So I am a farm girl from southern Minnesota. I'm a native of Minnesota like Mark is. And my husband and I live in the country with two beautiful girls and some cattle roaming around. But from a professional standpoint, I've actually worked in the legislative space for almost over 15 years and worked with various organizations primarily focused on agriculture policy and grassroots advocacy and giving a voice to farmers and ranchers, not only in Minnesota, but beyond. And then most recently, I worked for a financial services provider where I worked with legislative, but also some education and giving back in the corporate giving program. This last year, I took a career turn and have ventured out on my own and now run Martin and Company, which is a consulting firm focused on working with you all on coaching and training, but then also the legislative front, some strategic planning and business and development.
Yeah, so we are actually very excited that we'll be working with you more in the future. So if folks are listening to this, you might see Staci's face at a future event or on a future coaching call. So that's going to be really, really great. But today we are going to tap into some of your knowledge, some of your experience to talk about a topic that I think is a little different than maybe we talk about on the show here, but I think is really relevant to a lot of our audience. And so what we want to dig in today it is a topic from a couple of angles. One, I think you and I are probably aware, it's a little different being a woman in the working world, in the corporate space than maybe a lot of guys tend to be aware of. There's things that we have to consider that maybe others don't. And so we want to talk about what are some of those things? What should we be paying attention to? But also, we work with a lot of men who are managers of women. And so what are some of the things that as leaders and as supervisors that maybe they might not be aware of because it's different than their own experience that they can start to think about? So I'm not going to go too much farther than that because Staci, I really want to hear your thoughts on it. But my understanding is this actually came out of a conversation you and Mark were having. And so I'd love for you to just fill me in. What were you guys talking about and how did this arise?
Yeah, and Mark, feel free to jump in too. We're glad to have you on the podcast today as well.
Absolutely.
But Mark and I were having a conversation about a number of different things. And one of those was females in the workplace and how we can empower females. And as we were having that discussion, somehow the path led to the fact that there's a conversation that on occasion it needs to happen. And one of those is around safety in particular, that as females, well, we don't want to be treated differently. I am absolutely in that camp. I have a keen recognition over the years of being someone who travels a lot and a lot by myself, that there's some things I just have to think about that my male counterparts just weren't even aware of. And so Mark and I started down that path, and I started listing off some of the things that I consider as a female who travels alone, or that just as a female in general. And he went, wow, I've never thought of some of those things. And it was just, I think, Mark, you can jump in here, but it was one of those moments where he went, oh, we should be talking about this. And as someone who works, obviously, he works with females as well, that we need to have this conversation. And it's not about treating differently. It's about having awareness.
Absolutely. When Staci and I were talking about this, just in conversation one day, it occurred to me, number one, as a male leader in the corporate space, who has women on his team, who, a lot of our coaching clients are obviously female. Some of the things that Staci and I started talking about as I was looking at it from her angle, I know that I myself personally and a lot of our managers that we get a chance to work with and different people in the corporate space, leaders, male leaders, are quite frankly probably clueless to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about here today. So this was a really, I thought this was something that really needed to be addressed. I also don't see out here, whether it's audio, video, anything other than maybe some HR conversations inside a single company, anybody really addressing these things head on. And I said, you know what, we're going to step up and be that voice as a company here at MJST. So I thought this is a great place to start. And this may very well turn into a series and additional resources, but I thought this would be a great way to get it out there.
Awesome. Very good. So I think that's a really good introduction to how this came up. And I think it highlights the point that this is a topic that not a lot of people are talking about for a whole host of reasons, really. And so, Staci, I'm curious, and then maybe Mark, you can tag on any additional thoughts. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this is something that beyond maybe the HR quick conversation here or there, or I know in my experience, some of the things we're going to talk about have come from more experienced female mentors who were like, "Hey, you need to stop doing that," right? Who called it to my attention. And so I'm curious, why do you think that we're not having these conversations super frequently?
I think there's a number of reasons. Obviously, Staci, and some of the recent conversations that are being taken from a public standpoint, make the subject very sensitive, and it's very personal. And again, today I think awareness is our big focus. But one of the reasons in the workplace, I know for me, I didn't talk about it with my managers early on in my career because I didn't want to appear like I was expecting to be treated differently. And so it was almost like if I don't talk about it, they're not going to think that they need to do something different. In hindsight, that was probably the worst thing I could have done. I should have been talking about some of the concerns I had, but because it's such a sensitive topic and it's so personal, and everyone's going to have different experiences and expectations and comfort levels around some of the things that we're going to discuss. I think that a lot of times we keep it to ourselves because we don't want to appear like we can't do a job, or we can't do a role we've been given an opportunity to take on, or we can't take a certain role for some of the reasons that we're going to talk about. And that's absolutely not the case. If you open that communication line up, usually there's a way to figure things out. The other thing too, and Mark, you brought this up already, is it's a new subject to a lot of managers. And as a younger professional in particular, I don't know that my manager was even aware of any of those things. So they weren't going to raise it with me, and I wasn't comfortable raising it with them. So it comes back to that awareness and recognizing that we do need to have the conversation.
I will echo the last piece that Staci said. It's simply just a lack of awareness. If you've grown up in whatever business that you have gotten your professional experience in, if you're a young male salesperson and you go into a sales meeting behind a closed door with your buyer or whoever your prospect is, or you get into that combine and go ride with somebody, those of you that are listening that are not from an agricultural context, it's common for people to go ride in a combine during a harvest, to have that conversation with their customer or prospective customer. And, as unfair as it seems, right, and I'm just going to kind of get this out there, it's if a young man or a man goes into that situation or goes into the combine or goes behind those closed doors and walks out, nobody thinks anything of it. If a woman goes into behind that closed door or gets in that combine, rumors start. And we don't, guys don't consider that. We don't really think about that being a thing because it doesn't affect us. And so then why would we create resources? Why would we train? Why would we address it? Especially because now, like if you're that manager who potentially is perceived as treating women differently, you think you put yourself at risk. So I think that's what goes on or doesn't go on, quite frankly, in the mind of a lot of male leaders.
Yeah, I think those are very fair observations. So, Staci, I'm curious. You've shared some good ideas of why these conversations are not happening super frequently right now. But I'm curious a little bit, what got you thinking about this in the first place? What was your experience, as a maybe 20 something female in the professional world? I'm curious, especially if you traveled a lot, I bet I can echo a lot of your experiences, as I was in similar travel situations a lot early on. So I'm curious, how did this conversation start for you?
Well, I've always been one of those I can do anything girls. Growing up on a farm, I think most of us are instilled with that if he can do it, I can do it, and probably a little better. The whole Annie Oakley. I won't go into that, but I've always been one of those females, and I've always been aware of the fact that safety is important. Any of us who grew up from the really, in the 80s on, was very aware of safety, and it was something that was talked about in schools and hopefully at home. Going into college, it was the same way. There was a recognition that there's certain things you shouldn't do, like walk alone at night. So it wasn't that safety, and in particular, wasn't on my radar. It's just that as I became a professional, and specifically a professional who took on sort of a non-traditional female role in a male-dominated arena, I tipped back into that I can do anything type of mentality. And when I did that, I started, taking on travel and doing things that maybe I wasn't thinking as well as I should. And one perfect example of that, and when I really became aware of the fact that I needed to start thinking about things differently, was I was in my mid-20s, and I was in northern Minnesota around Bemidji. So from those of you from the upper Midwest know that you're getting you're not to Canada, but you're a lot closer than you are if you're in southern Minnesota where I grew up. And it's pretty desolate in certain parts through the woods up there. And I had left one meeting late at night and was on my way to another meeting. And at that time, we were still a little pre-GPS, but I lost cell phone service. I was in the middle of northern Minnesota in an unfamiliar place, and probably at 9 or 10 at night. No cell phone service. I was in heels and a dress and had nothing but a printed map. And about halfway between my two destinations, I went, wow, I've never felt this vulnerable. I really didn't think this through. And from that point on, I use that as a moment to start thinking about things differently. And I can, as I talk about it, I can remember and actually see where I had that moment where I felt the vulnerability and I didn't know what I was going to do if my car broke down, for example. And that was really a turning point for me as a professional of I can still do things and I can still be that I can do anything girl, but I have to think about things in a little different way than maybe I even realized at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting how much you don't even think of those things either until you end up in the situation or someone brings it to your attention. The littlest things. So prior to this role, I worked for an advertising agency. And so we were always traveling for client meetings in our account groups. And I had, at the time I had a male manager. And so, there was a group of us, and I remember like early on, it was no big deal for me to say, hey, I've got this thing for our client meetings in my hotel room. Just swing by and grab it. And I give him a lot of credit because he was smart enough to he just let me grab it and give it to him, never came in, that sort of thing. But it wasn't until later when someone was making, bringing up some of these things about what to do when traveling that I went, oh, maybe, meet in the lobby to transfer things or and again, I think to your point earlier, we don't bring these things up because I don't want to come across as though I don't trust that person. Cause I don't have any, I have no qualms, no worries, no anything. But coming back to the fact, it's not about whether you trust the other person. It's about reducing risk because you just never know. And so that was always a hard thing for me because, I never wanted to come across as though I didn't think you were a good person or I didn't think I should trust you. And so that kind of goes back to the earlier comments about why we don't have those conversations. But it continues to this day to amaze me how much I don't pay attention to these things until someone else brings it to my attention.
Yep, exactly.
So, okay, so you got caught in Minnesota and kind of, had that experience of, oh, maybe I need to do some things a little differently. So I'm curious, what are some steps that you take nowadays, or what are some steps that you recommend to other women who may find themselves in those situations or who travel a lot for work or just to be more aware? What are some tips that you might recommend?
There's a long list, actually, Amanda. We probably could do a whole podcast just on that and bring an expert in on self-defense and some other things. But a few things that if I had a younger professional in particular, but anyone who was taking on a role where they were traveling, that I look at is one, planning your timing better. So after that experience in northern Minnesota, I was much more conscientious about how I planned meeting to meeting. So in that case, I was trying to get from one meeting to the next early the next morning. And so I put myself in a position where I was traveling late at night by myself. So just the timing aspect of things, I really to this day work on that. And a lot of it's around the need of not being in all those vulnerable situations. I started telling someone my starting point and my end point. At the time, it was my mom. That was pre-marriage. And now it's my husband. But just letting them know that so someone knows where you're supposed to be. And if, you didn't call, then that way at least someone understands what your route was going to be. I know we have a lot of sales listeners out there. One tip that I've heard for sales is as you're going out and planning your day, tell one of your coworkers what your day looks like so that they have a recognition around what your day is going to look like if there would be a need to figure out where you were or what you were doing. Some other steps are not flying alone into a city late at night. In my last role, I had a conversation with my manager actually, and we had I don't remember if it was a last minute meeting, I believe it was, that came up, and I was in a position where I was going to maybe have to take almost one of those, really late night flights. I was going to be getting in at midnight, and I said, I won't do it. I won't fly into a city that I am unfamiliar with, in particular after 9 o'clock at night, because there's fewer security guards around, there's fewer people at the airport, there's fewer people on the road when you get into a cab or take Uber or whatever means you need to take. So those are a few. Like I said, I've got a whole list. Asking for an escort at your hotel. Most hotels, especially if you're in a larger city, will have someone that will escort you to your room. I ask for hotel rooms by elevator so you're not walking down a long hall after hours. Some of those types of things. The other thing that I like to do is when I get into cabs, I pull up my destination so I know where they should be taking me. And it also keeps them honest too, because you can ask them why they're not taking you on the shortest route. But that gives me an awareness of where we should be going. And if we start to diverge from that, then I can start asking questions. And one that was really honestly hard for me at first, was asking for a different hotel room if something didn't seem right. And it's really important. I remember one night where I came into a rural hotel late in the evening, got to my room, and the door wasn't shut, and it looked like something had happened with the lock. I turned right around and went back up and said, I need a different room. That was a big step for me, because I think a few years earlier, I don't know that I would have done it. I probably wouldn't have slept all night, but asking for a different hotel room and not being concerned about doing that are some steps you can take. And I think we'll hopefully get a chance to talk about how you have a conversation with your manager too. But those are just a few things. We could go on and on. I think about different steps and different tips that we have. But that's one. Those are a few examples.
And those are a lot of really good ideas. I've also heard you can do this at any hotel. So if you've been at some hotels, some front desk people are terrible at saying room numbers out loud. If you are in a situation where maybe you're in line with other people and the front desk person says your room out loud as they hand you the keys, you have every right to ask them to give you a new room, and in whatever way is comfortable, ask them not to say that room number out loud. There are a lot of hotels that are, I think, changing how they train their front desk staff to just, they write it and they say and point to it. Here's your room number, to avoid that. But that's the other one I've heard, just because you want to eliminate opportunities for, people to hear what room you're in and be able to use that. So that's the other one that I would add to that list. But one question, Staci, I have is for people who might say, and women in particular, because I'm going to lump myself into this. I'll be a little honest. When Mark said, hey, we're going to do this conversation with Staci about female safety at work, I was kind of like, oh boy, where is this going to go? So I'm curious for women who might feel like, I don't want to live in fear, right? A lot of these things could feel like, oh my gosh, I have to be scared of everything. And I don't want to do that. I should be able to work without feeling scared of doing all of these things or of traveling or whatever. What kind of perspective would you share with folks who might feel as though this is saying like, oh, you should be nervous about things?
I would say that the reason we're having this conversation today is absolutely about not living in fear, but just having the awareness is so important so you don't put yourself in a vulnerable position. And I've traveled for over 15 years, and by having this awareness, it actually gives me more confidence in my ability to do my job because I am aware I'm not putting myself in a position anymore if there was the key, because I did that early on. I try not to put myself in those positions anymore where I could end up having a negative experience while I am traveling. And that gives me more confidence as I'm going out the door, down the road, or getting on the plane, because I am thinking about those things, but I'm thinking of them in a way, and Mark, you talk about this often, is about your story. I don't use it as a story of fear, but rather it's a story of confidence, courage, and competence, and the ability to know that I'm prepared to the extent that I can be for a situation I might run into. And I've taken steps to avoid maybe some uncomfortable situations that then could lead to all kinds of conversations or experiences that I don't want to have. We can't prevent anything. Any one of us could have conversations about safety, male or female. It's part of who we are. It's a society we live in. We don't ever want to take that for granted, but we also don't want to live in fear. The awareness of it and having those conversations can help alleviate some of the anxiety and stress that can come along with traveling in particular, so that we can thrive and we can do our jobs and we can focus on that.
So I want to pile on here just a little bit because, to expound on this a little bit, one of the things that you're mentioning here, Staci, right, basically boils back to one of the things that we teach in our programs, which is the 6 basic human needs. Number one on that list is certainty. And if you're going into a work situation in any way, shape, or form where you feel uncertain about safety, which is one of just those basic human needs, then it actually detracts from your ability to do your job well. And I don't think a lot of people think of, safety and people actually feeling vulnerable, especially in a male-dominated workforce that has largely been created by men over time. It's just not built to think about reasons that others not male might potentially feel unsafe. And so I think that's one of the reasons for having the conversation. And that's a big deal, so what I'm thinking about this from my perspective, how can I help my team, people on my team, coaching clients, et cetera, feel a greater sense of certainty in doing the work, right? Or how can we influence the marketplace to be able to create more certainty for everybody, regardless of sex, and there's a lot of different things that can get piled onto that. But in the context of this conversation today, I think this is fair. I think this is a really big one. And I want to just share, there's two things that happened before Staci and I started talking about this that happened that gave me my little bit of a discovery moment. They're like, oh, there's definitely more to this. One of the ways that this became really relevant to me is I was in a coaching conversation with one of our female coaching clients who literally was in conversations, with customers. The recommendation was to go and see them, in their combines as they were going through the field during harvest in the fall. And she said, well, I have this whole other step. I have this other thing that I have to do. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And it really, what it drives is insecurity for her getting in those combines, because people see her, a young female salesperson, going into that combine, and people start talking. So she had to go through this whole extra step of actually talking to the farmer's wife, building a relationship with her, and having that conversation there first, and then saying, hey, are you okay if I do go jump in the combine and ride with Fred, or whatever his name was? And there was another case where, and this actually came up at an event where we were talking about prospecting, and it was a sale, a little bit of, we were doing a little bit of sales training. And one of the things that I'd never thought about was Google mapping the farm to see, what they had on that place, whether they had animals, livestock, grain bins, different things like that. And this is what was interesting. They're not only using it to get intel on what was on that place. One girl said, and I'm looking for my getaway. I'm looking for my escape route in case I need to go. And that really woke me up right there. And then this conversation with Staci came up. So Staci, I'm just kind of interested in your feedback or take on those two situations. I mean, is that, have you seen stuff like that? Do you think those are appropriate measures to take? Is that fair? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So you just came up with a whole nother podcast, I think, because there's a safety component that we are talking about, and just some of the awareness. And as Amanda, as I said, as we've been sitting here and I was listening to Mark, I came up with a whole nother list of things that I would love to give as tips as far as things that I think about. But then there's this other component of right, wrong, or otherwise fair or unfair, the perception component. And I've had conversations with a number of female sales team members over the years who have taken many of the same steps that you're talking about, Mark. There is the reality that getting into a vehicle alone with a farmer, Amanda, you said it well, we want to trust everybody. And I have little kids. We read the Berenstain Bears about strangers. And one of the things that Mama Bear says is, most apples are good apples, but there's an occasional bad one. And we need to treat everybody as if there's good, but know that there's a few bad apples out there. And we talk about that a lot with our little girls. Well, that transfers well to us as adults. The vast majority of people are good people, but unfortunately there's a few that take advantage of situations. And being in sales roles, Mark, I think you hit on something that is a strong sensitivity that's not talked about a lot for a lot of the reasons we've already discussed as to why things aren't brought up. And one of them comes down to wanting to be in that position and thrive and not be seen as being different. But the reality is, before you jump in a combine or a truck and head across a field with someone, especially someone on a cold call that you've never met or built a relationship with, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position. And both from a safety standpoint, but Mark, to your point, a perception standpoint. Honestly, one of the measures that I've adopted, and I know some people kind of chuckle when I say it, every time I share it with the female, they say, yeah, I get it. I would end up in positions where I traveled a lot with males. Most of my interactions are with males. If I was traveling with a single male, so just he and I always made sure I had met his wife first, and I knew them, and we had talked to them, and if I could, made sure that they had met my husband, so that they knew that everything was cool and there were no questions. Also conscientious about when we were leaving together, how we were leaving, because unfortunately, I have had an experience in my career where that perception was out there of me that was not positive. And it was a really awful experience. And it was an unfounded experience, one that had no merit and no grounds. But having gone through something where there was a perception of me that was very inaccurate, really shaped the way I interacted and went about things. And I was open with the folks that I work with about this. I said, hey, you know what? I'm not comfortable traveling with you alone unless these things happen. But it took time for me to get to that point. I know other females that just won't travel with men. They'll go on their lone route because they don't want that perception, especially if it's going to be them and one or two males. Right, wrong, or otherwise, this is just the times we live in and things that we need to think about. And there's, again, I think a whole nother podcast on that standpoint. As far as the safety, I also have heard the Google Maps, not only for females, but for males too. I know in working in the financial services industry, some of those discussions can not always be the easiest discussions that take place. And when I was in that industry, I know many males who also would do the same thing because they knew that they were going into a situation that might be a tough conversation with a farmer, and lots of times, wanted to make sure that they knew the farm too. So it's the reality. And Mark, I think your point around our basic needs and that certainty, it's not living in a state of fear. It's having awareness, having that certainty to the extent that we can get it, so we can go into a situation and be comfortable and do our job to the best of our abilities and take it to the next level in a very positive way.
I like it. I mean, and I appreciate that very much. I'm sitting here thinking as we talk through this stuff from there's two angles. So I have two more, I guess, follow-up questions for you, Staci. So the next one is if I am a female in the workplace and, I'm listening to this and now I'm starting to think through, because of awareness, how do I actually deploy this? How do I get over, and you've hit on this a little bit and talked about it's been uncomfortable. It's been something that you've had to lean into. In our work, we call it the appropriate effort, which is usually the thing that you don't want to do. How do I lean into this sort of maybe a potentially uncomfortable conversation? Maybe I don't feel worthy of having this conversation. Maybe my priority is just to fit in and to ignore my need for security. So how do I get past that mountain that I have to maybe climb? Or how do I get, obviously it's in my mind, but how do I get past that unwillingness to move into that conversation?
I think, Amanda, you hit on something really, really key at the beginning of this too. And each work situation is going to be different. Each company culture is going to be different. And so part of it is just recognizing what your company culture is. But Amanda, you hit on finding that female who's maybe a little more experienced and utilizing them as a mentor. That's one key area that if you're not comfortable talking to your direct manager, at least initially, about it, I would highly recommend that. I know I was talking to one of MJSC's clients not too long ago, and they go in and out of hog facilities and have to shower in and shower out. And she was in a position where she was looking at how she could, help others who haven't maybe had to do that before. So they had that certainty, that comfort going through that experience for the first or second time as a female. She was in a position where she was looking to mentor. And that way, that individual who was maybe not at a comfort level of talking to their direct manager, or Mark, to your point, their manager just didn't think about it for no other reason than they weren't aware of it. And so that mentor or finding someone to lean on, heck, people can call me. I'd be open to having conversations with people.
Yeah.
HR is always a really good route. If you can talk to your HR person, part of their job is safety on a whole lot of levels beyond what we're just talking about here. But their job is workplace safety, whether it's training and everything else that encompasses that. But if you can talk to your manager and broach it, take baby steps. You don't have to jump all in and say, these are all the things that I'm uncomfortable with. But maybe share this podcast with them and then say, can we discuss this a little bit after you listen to this podcast? I'd like to talk to you more about this. Or find an article and have share that with them, so they're reading it first, and then say, I'd like to talk more with you about this, and take ease into it as opposed to maybe jumping right into it. I'm at the point now where doing this podcast was not vulnerable to me. I see it as a way to share the information, and I'm happy to have this conversation with anyone. I wasn't there at the beginning of my career, and we've already talked about that. And so hopefully someone out there who is at the beginning of their career hears this and can take steps that I didn't take early on, because having that conversation, I think, would have avoided some uncomfortable situations, even from a safety standpoint for me early on in my career.
Thank you.
Amanda, what are your thoughts? Oh, sorry. We were going to try not to talk over each other. Amanda, what are some of your thoughts on this? Because I know you had said that until sometimes some people raise things with you that you weren't always aware. What are your thoughts on how people can approach it from your perspective?
Yeah, I just wanted to layer in a thought on the topic of finding particularly a female mentor. That's not to say that this conversation can't be led by male managers or mentors, and I think we're going to pivot here to that question shortly. But one thing that has been and continues to be a game changer, because I'll admit I'm probably I don't know if I would say naive as much as, I believe I'm a pretty independent, strong person. And so I want to portray that is who I am. And so some of these things, the idea of like asking for a different hotel room or especially like not traveling with just one other guy, like to me, like I really struggle with that idea because I don't want to ever be perceived. And this is, again, no judgment against anybody who that is your approach to it. But for me personally, I don't want to be perceived as someone who can't go out and do their job because they won't travel with a male colleague. Like that's just my personal opinion. And so it has really helped me to have a female mentor who I think is an independent, strong badass, if I'm going to be real honest, be the one saying, you need to think about these things. Because if I still perceive her as that, and she's saying you need to be paying attention to the situations you're putting yourself in, then I can reframe like, this is not weak. This does not mean that you are overly dependent or that you're going to be perceived as something. It's about being smart and using your brain. And so for me, that is the real power, or has been personally the real power of having that female mentor who I already had this perception of her being a badass. And so it then gave her the ability to challenge me where I was maybe not using my brain as much as I could. So I just wanted to layer that thought in.
I love it. And absolutely. And that's part of the reason, Mark, I think you wanted to do this podcast is, Amanda, you are a strong, independent female. And I hope that that's what others see me as well. And one of the things that I experienced early on, you sound just like me, actually, because I didn't want to be perceived as any of those, as weak, or that I couldn't do something, or that I wasn't able to do the job. And now looking back, that's not the case. It's the reality that you do need to make smart decisions, and you still can thrive and you still can kick butt. And so good for you for sharing that. And thank you for your willingness to share that, because it's not easy to have these conversations. And I hope that this podcast helps facilitate some of those.
Thank you. Mark, did you have another thought?
I do. I can't help. I just have to say this. I got to throw this in because as we're going through this, like I'm envisioning being able to share this with my two little girls, but who are getting like not so littler by the day. And Amanda, when you said, like I wanted, that badass mentor, type woman, like I want them to be able to get paired up with one of you guys whenever they enter the workspace to just understand more about that. Like I'm doing the best I can. Like I get Maggie into, workouts over at Mix, and she learns a little bit of self-defense, and, I try to get them around some of those things. But I mean, at the end of the day, I just want them to feel empowered, not entitled, but empowered to be able to define the game according to their terms so that they can go play it in their way. And so I just wanted to throw that in. I'm sitting here thinking like, wow, I'm literally creating this for my daughters. And now Staci's got a couple little girls too, right? And that's really, we're just trying to pave the way in a better way. And I think that makes it a really good point, or this is a really good point to pivot over to, from the guy's perspective, for the male manager's perspective. I mean, the people that are in my shoes and others like me, I literally asked this question to a group of executives. There's 2 CEOs and 2 vice presidents that are on one of my coaching groups that I'm working with right now. And I said, guys, I'm thinking about creating this resource. Let me just ask you this. Have you thought about some of these things? Have you thought that it might, that it might be a little bit different experience for a woman going into some of the same situations that you've built your career upon? And they all looked at me with like blank faces. Like, no, we've never even considered that somebody else might be experiencing a different feeling than I feel when I go into my sales call, or when I go into my management meeting, or when I go into my performance review, or whatever the case might be. So help us out, Staci. So we need some actionable things that dudes can do in this role to be able to create the space.
To me, the more we're going through this conversation, the more it's empowering to me. Then, Amanda, you mentioned that state of fear early on. I'm getting more empowered even throughout this conversation and listening to your two experiences. And so as a manager, rather than thinking of it as a sensitive subject that you need to avoid, think of it as another tool for you to use to empower female leaders within your organization. And if you think of it that way and change that story around it, away from fear and sensitivity, well, you should be sensitive to it. Obviously, it's a personal subject. By having a conversation or by having the awareness and learning more, you're now positioning yourself to empower females potentially in a way that, as Mark, you just pointed out, you got blank stares before that before they never would have thought about those things. And so based on your individual experiences and your relationships with your team, I think there's a few different ways you can approach it. Again, using this podcast is maybe one, and sending it out to your team as a whole. Even you don't have to single out females, but sending out to your team as a whole and say, hey, as your team leader, if you have multiple team members who travel, for example, as your team leader, your safety is important to me. If you ever have concerns about safety, I listened to this podcast and it really opened my eyes. If you have concerns about safety, I'm here to listen. And I'll be talking to you about it at your next check-in or your next review, and use that as kind of a segue and let them think about it. And then when you have that next check-in or you have that next one-on-one conversation, bring it up, open the door. And if they don't want to talk about it, then that's up to them. But at least you open the door to that conversation. And one thing that I would say is that you shouldn't do, especially if you're a male that manages a number of women, is like bring everybody into a room and say, we're going to talk about this. Because right there, you're creating a really uncomfortable environment. To me, these conversations are definitely more one-on-one conversations when you have those check-ins or that yearly review or whatever your process is, to say, hey, your safety is important to me. If you're ever not feeling safe, I want to know about it, one. And if there's something we can do to help you, I'm here for you and I want to support you. And so those are just a few things that I think are rather soft ways to broach a conversation that might be sort of vulnerable and uncomfortable and new territory for many managers. The other thing that I would challenge, and I do this myself as a female, is, okay, if I were in their shoes, it's being empathetic, it's putting yourself in someone else's shoes, what would I need to think about? I honestly do it with my girls now of, okay, I'm an adult and I have an awareness of the world that they don't have. I need to get not down on my knees to their level, but in a sense, what are they seeing from their level? And what do I need to do to change how I interact with them or the conversations that we have, because they're experiencing things for the first time in a way that I take for granted. It's really that same type of thing of putting yourself in their shoes and saying, okay, if I was a female, would I feel vulnerable? Oh, wow, I haven't thought about that. And Mark, you've had even today a couple, oh, wow moments. And so those would be some tips that I have that I think are pretty soft ways to, as a team leader or manager, to move into that conversation. Amanda or Mark, do you have others?
The only other thought I would just layer on is sometimes some of these conversations, and I guess it sort of goes back to the earlier points, are easier to have when there is rapport or a relationship or whatnot. So I guess two trains of thought. One, it emphasizes the importance of getting to know your people at a deeper level beyond this conversation. If this is the first time you're trying to have a conversation to show you care and you've never had that before with me, I'm going to look at you a little with the little side eye going, is this, does he really care, or has he just been told by HR he has to have this conversation with me? So to me, it just emphasizes developing real relationships with your people, that they're not just there to do a job and go home. It makes having these conversations a little bit easier because they trust that you're initiating the conversation for the right reason, because they do trust you and they do think you're coming from a good place. The other thought I would just have is, is I think there are some times when, as I'm just going to say it, as a male leader, you may not be able to have the conversation on a level with your female employees, just because you don't share that same perspective or worldview. And so I think it emphasizes the importance of looking for opportunities to move women into positions of leadership where they can, they may not be that young person's direct manager, but if you as a male manager are not the best person to have that conversation, you've got other people on your management or leadership team who might be able to connect at a different level than you can. And the other thing is be networking in your industry. I'll say we work with a lot of organizations where senior leadership management teams are heavily male. So you may have to go outside of your organization to connect your young female employees with mentors, female mentors in other organizations or parallel industries. I think that's been something that is really cool about our coaching program and having men and women on the MJST team is I know I have been, asked to work with certain women who all of their managers, all of their leaders are men. And so that's part of why coaching is cool, is because they get introduced to another woman in a leadership position. So I think that's something to think about too, is diversifying your leadership team can be an incredibly powerful tool in any number of ways, of which this is just one of them.
Amanda, that's a really great point. And I can think of a specific example where there's a colleague that I've worked with over the years, and they're in a situation where they're one of very few other female senior leaders, and they do end up in that position a lot, and they're happy to be in the position where females will come to them, or other managers will say, can you please work with X, Y, or Z team member, because I think you, female leader, have a better perspective or a different perspective that you can help guide them through these conversations. And so they actually have that other duties as assigned or unwritten role within their organization because they're a trusted leader. They are female, and they have the trust not only of the team, but also of their fellow senior leaders. And so they partner together, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you as a leader aren't comfortable having a conversation, it's incumbent upon you as a leader then to figure out how you help support your team member. And it may not be that one-on-one conversation. It may be, to your point, Amanda, finding someone to partner them with to help guide them through whatever it is that they're working through. And in this case, we're talking about safety and some of the considerations that females have to have. So I think that's a really good tip.
I will just say this. Do I have a lot of great ideas? I don't know. I'm a leader who probably leads with a lot more vulnerability than most leaders are comfortable leading with. It works for me. And so I guess the biggest thing is, can you create that conversation in a team context, within the organization, and this isn't necessarily pertaining to this topic, but I'll go to Amanda or Christina or anybody else on my team for that matter and say, hey, help me see this a little bit more from your perspective. Or what are my blind spots? What am I not seeing here? And I think that's just good behavior from a leadership perspective to get other input, recognizing that yours you may be seeing only what you're used to seeing, what your eye is trained to being able to see. And so there are other perspectives. And so I think that's just generally good behavior, even outside of this context, to create that. And I'll just pile on one more thing. I think as leaders in the workplace, we really have, I believe, a moral obligation to just pay attention. Let's just pay attention. I mean, this is in the media, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now around this topic, female safety in particular, but there's some real shit that's gone down recently in rural parts of just Iowa, right next door here to Nebraska, where, two, young women just out for a run, right? Just out, out for a run on a country road, out doing some things we're taken advantage of, and some bad things happened, right? So I just think we have an obligation to just take care of our workforce, men and women, and make sure that people have awareness, make sure that people have a plan. So lead that conversation, have the gut to have that conversation, stop avoiding it. Because I don't want to be the guy, I don't want you to be the guy that doesn't have that conversation and then something happens.
So we are closing in here on our time. And so, Staci, I'm just curious, any final thoughts you want to throw in for the good of the conversation?
Please use this conversation as awareness and not that fear component as we've talked about. It really is a focus on empowering and having awareness and being able to have the certainty and comfort around any role that you're in so you feel safe, so you can go out and thrive and be a better you. And so that's what this was all about. And I hope today everyone can walk away feeling a little more empowered through an awareness standpoint and from an information standpoint.
Well, I know I do. So I'm sure that other people will feel the same as well. So thank you, Staci, for coming on the show. And I'm sure this will be just one of many visits to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. So we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. On that same note, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewel Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.